All right, topic 4.2. Topic 4.2 is pretty quick, so I think we should be able to get through this pretty much one video here. There's a bunch of review questions though, so bear with. So topic 4.2, nominal versus real interest rates, module 24, if you're following along in the book. By the way, this is pretty much all review. This is all stuff we did in Unit 2 when we talked about GDP earlier and price index. Okay, so nominal interest rates, right? We talked about what this all is. When you get a loan or a bond, you get an interest rate in nominal numbers. So meaning, it isn't adjusted for inflation. Today, you get a $1,000 loan with 10% interest. That's just what it is. And that's on a piece of paper, the bond, the par value of the bond. That's just what that piece of paper says, and so that's locked in. Those are locked in nominal numbers. So that means it doesn't adjust for inflation. Why does the inflation rate matter? Well, because remember, we know that nominal isn't the same as real, and if price index changes, $1,000 today means something different than $1,000 5 years from now, especially if inflation is 2 to 3% every year. So think about our broken arm example. Yeah, I'm just pulling that same example from Unit 2 that I gave you before. You broke your arm, and your friend offered you $100 today because you didn't have money to fix, go to the ER or whatever. So your friend offered you $100 today and said, next year, the same day, next year, you give me $110. Okay. What interest rate is your friend charging you? That's pretty straightforward. It seems pretty simple. So $100, 110, well, 10%. So your friend charged you a 10% nominal interest rate. So based on, today's numbers, he said $100, 10%, those are all nominal numbers, right? But inflation was 2%. So did he actually charge you 10% interest? He gave you $100 in last year's dollars, the current year here, but this year's dollars are worth less. So when you go back to pay him, you give him $110. You didn't actually give him $110 in, say 2020 to 2021. You didn't give him $100 or $110 in 2021 numbers, basically. You got extra value in 2020, that first year. You got $100 and it meant $100. But because of inflation of 2%, that $100 buys 2% less now in 2021. Once again, hopefully I'll review. Hopefully I'm not making it more confusing. If you're really stuck on that stuff, go back to Unit 2 and reread price index stuff. All right, so you paid him back $100 plus 10, but today he'd actually need $102 to buy the same amount of stuff on the market basket, that $100 would have bought the year before. So, obviously the prices have changed and they've gone up slightly to $102, so that $100 buys less. So what was his real return? All right, he thought he was charging you 10%, but what was his real return? The real interest rate. And this is, by the way, this is what 4.2 is. This is the entire gist of it right here. So the real interest rate. You gave him back $110, but he really only got $8 in purchasing power for his original $100 investment. So he did get some return on investment, but it was not the original 10% that you and he were probably figuring that was going to work out. So without inflation, the equation would have been this: 10 divided by 100 is 10%. $10 return on the $100 current price index, consumer price index. But that's not reality. So he was thinking $10 return on a $100 investment, 10% interest then. But the reality is, with 2% inflation in the equation, he got $8 of additional purchasing power on a price index of now 102 instead of a $100 price index. So that's actually only 7.8%, instead of 10%. So instead of getting 10% interest, he actually got 7.8. All right, and I know this seems weird and confusing. You won't be doing this math. Just gonna throw that out there. There's a way easier way for the AP exam. There's a way easier way to do it. You can always do it in your head. Remember, you don't use a calculator on the AP exam. So this is the hard way. You won't be doing this unless you are a banker, unless you are working out in the financial industry. You won't be needing to do anything like this. This is the technical way to do it. The reality is it's a lot simpler, and we'll get to that in a second. All right, so the power of hindsight. Obviously, your friend didn't make back 10%, but what if he never planned to? What if your friend was a clever banker, all right, and they said, hey, you know what? I'm going to charge you 10%, but I'm smart and I know what inflation is, and I realize that I don't need that extra 10%. I just want to make, cover inflation and maybe make a small profit. And so they were okay with 7.8% as a real return. And this is kind of how banks work. Banks aren't dumb. They know that, and lending institutions in general, they're not dumb. They know what inflation is. It's been around for a while. And so when they give you a loan, they realize that inflation is going to take away, it's going to cut into that interest rate that they thought they were charging you. And so when they work out the loans, they do a lot of tricks to make sure that they make profit off of it. Now, if inflation is massive, right? If we saw like 20% inflation, we would have a lot of problems in the economy. But also, yeah, then they would lose money on that loan, right? They would go under for that one. But that's outlandish, hopefully, and not going to happen. Of course, this is a bit like gambling. Like I said, if inflation went up unexpectedly, the return would keep shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. But this is how the world works. This is how loans work. Real interest rates, this is an important point here. Real interest rates can only truly be calculated in hindsight. Think about that. We need to know what the inflation rate is in order to calculate real interest rates. All right. And by the way, you've probably pieced together the easier way of figuring out what the real interest rate was. If you know 7.8, I know that might be throwing some of you off, but 2% inflation, and we originally charged 10% interest. That might be giving you some clues. Just around. So, one thing I want to point out here too, if you ever go to buy a house, all right, I want to show you this here. If you ever go to buy a house, this is how your mortgage payment will work out. Every month for 30 years, your mortgage payment will be the same amount. All right, so they'll be the same amount. And that's your monthly with principal, the amount of the loan, the total amount you borrowed, plus interest. Notice here, this is an amortization chart, basically how your mortgage dies, how your payments, where the money goes in each payment. Mortgage math is fun and calculated because it's over 30 years, right? 30 years of inflation can really add up. And banks aren't stupid. And so when you get a bank loan to buy a house, they actually charge you the interest first. For the first 15 years, you're actually paying mostly interest and very little principal. So when you get a loan for, say, like $100,000 and you buy a house, the first 15 years, most of your monthly payment, most of that $700 is actually going to pay the interest. Why do they do that? Because they know that inflation is taking away the interest. Interest is why the bank gave you the loan. They want to make profit off of you. And so they charge that interest up front so that inflation doesn't steal it all away. After 15 years, you start paying more of your principal, and then you finally actually pay off the house. That's how the mortgage industry works. They realize what interest rates are, they realize what inflation is, and they calculate it out in a fancy mortgage math way, which you can look online. It's not hard to do. And it'll tell you basically all this. All right, back to this stuff. All right, so real interest rates can only truly be calculated in hindsight once you know what the actual rate of inflation was. And like I said, this was the hard way. You won't be doing this on the AP exam. This is the good enough way. This is what you're going to see on the AP exam. So remember how your friend gave you $110? Or remember how you gave your friend $110 in return for $100, but inflation was 2%, so $102 had the same purchasing power as $100 did the year before. That's all recap. Well, 110 minus 102 is $8, right? So 10% nominal interest rate minus 2% inflation just happens to be 8%. Yes, 7.8 is more correct. Figuring out like the exact number, the exact real interest rate based off of purchasing powers and things like that is more correct. But your AP exam, you should be okay calculating real interest rates is just whatever the nominal was, so our 10%, minus actual inflation, which was 2%, will equal the real interest rate. This is what the AP wants you to use, and it makes it a lot simpler. So 10 minus 2 is equal to 8. Yes, 7.8 is technically more accurate. And if this was a college class and you were doing more advanced economics, then maybe that's how they'd want you to calculate it. But you probably also get a calculator. The AP exam, no calculator. This is good enough. So it's the good enough way. Why ever use the hard way? You and I might not care, right? If you're just doing it in your head real quick and you're like, oh, okay, 10 minus 2, okay, I can figure that out. But if you end up working for a bank one day, they might, because 0.2% interest rates to you and me, like when we're talking about, $10 is not a big deal. But what if you're using millions of dollars or billions of dollars? 0.2% can add up really fast. And so when you're using huge sums of money, that 0.2%, 7.8 compared to 8% might be a big deal. Unless you're rich, who cares? But anyways, also some loans use compound interest, and most loans use compound interest, and as a result, every little bit adds up. That 0.2% adds up when you're compounding interest, and don't worry about that right now. All right, review questions. Ygritte loaned Mans $100. Mans paid her back $110 1 year later. Well, this seems like a similar example. The annual rate of inflation was 3%. What was the real interest rate that Ygritte earned on this loan? This should be pretty easy. I mean, it's just one number different from the example we've done. The answer is 7%. How could we possibly figure that out, right? Well, Ygritte earned, well, let's just look back at the example here. So $100, paid her back $110, so they were expecting a 10% interest, right? But inflation was 3%. The prices had changed. And so she actually, she actually got 7% back in return. So where we were doing with a 2% inflation rate, this is 3 instead of 8. It's 7. It's almost the exact same example. So hopefully that one you got it pretty easily. So 10 minus 3, 7%. So she was expecting a 10% nominal interest rate, but inflation stole 3% of it. She got 7%. The Iron Bank wants to make sure that the purchasing power of the interest that they get paid on loans is at least 11%. Real GDP is increasing at 5% per year, and the expected rate of inflation is 7% per year. If all banks in Westeros want to earn the same real return as the Iron Bank, what is the nominal interest rate, NIR, in Westeros? Ooh. Oh, man. There's some distracting information in this one. The AP exam does this stuff too, where they like to give you questions that has more information than they actually need. Can you figure out what information is not necessary? Well, let's look at the question again. The Iron Bank wants to make sure that they blah, 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 interest and loans. So they want to make sure that the real money they're making back is at least 11%. So, and that's what they're talking about. Make sure the purchasing power of interest they get paid on loans is at least 11%. So they're looking at purchasing power. They want to make 11% return. Real GDP is increasing at 5%. Expected inflation is 7%. All right, now this is expected. So once again, hindsight is the only way to really get true real interest rates. But, you know, if you're planning for the future, you want to be able to plan according to the inflation rate that you're expecting. That's how banks work. They say this is the expected rate of inflation, so this is what we're going to charge you for this loan. All right. If you haven't figured it out yet, I'll give you a hint. Who cares about real GDP? Right? Remember the equation I gave you. Boop, boop, boop. Nominal interest rate minus actual inflation rate will give you the real interest rate. Nominal, actual, so nominal interest, actual inflation. Who cares what GDP is doing right now when we just have these numbers here? So we know we want to make 11% return. All right, that's not what we're going to charge. All right, that's what we want to make sure that the purchasing power is. That's what we want to make sure we get 11%. And we expect this, 7% inflation to occur. So what is the smallest amount? What is the nominal interest rate? What is the you know, they could obviously charge more, but what is the lowest amount if they want to make 11% return with 7% inflation? Well, if they know 7% is of their money, their interest rate that they're charged is going to get stolen away, well, if they want to make 11, they need to charge at least 18%. So we're just kind of working it backwards in this case, but then you're going to charge at least 18%. Why? Because then 7% of that money will be stolen. 7% of that interest rate will be stolen by inflation. And that other 11% will be what they actually earn. So they will hope to earn 11%. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, just remember that they sometimes throw information at you that's not important. Don't try to mix it in. Just remember the equation. The interest rate that the bank charged you on your loan last year was 9%. 1 year later, you find that it costs you 2% more to buy goods and services this year than last year. It costs you 2% more to buy goods. What is that? 2% increase in prices. I wonder if we had a word for that. All right, based on this information, what was the nominal interest rate, real interest rate, and rate of inflation? Okay, I mean, I was joking around, but this is pretty straightforward, right? 1 year later, you find that costs you 2% more to buy goods and services. Well, what's another way of saying something that prices have gone up 2%? It's inflation. So we know right away that we can cut out some of these answers here. So maybe it's B, who knows? But inflation rate of 2%, inflation rate of 2%. These ones are wrong, right? Because it doesn't say anything about those ones. You know, prices went up 2%. All right. So the interest rate the bank charged you on your loan last year was 9%. Okay, so that was the nominal interest rate. That was the nominal interest rate. So they charged you 9%, but there was 2% inflation. So what does that mean your real interest rate is? So hopefully you guys figured this out. Nominal interest rate was 9%. That's what they told you, right? That's what they charged you. We know that inflation was 2%. So 9 minus 2, 7%. All right. I think this might be the last one. The Iron Bank of Westeros charges the Lannister family 12% interest on their loans. The director of finance at the bank collected information about the economy in Westeros over the past year as shown in the table below. So real GDP growth was 3%. Increase in the real GDP deflator was 7%. What was the real interest rate the Iron Bank earned on these loans? Okay, so the Iron Bank, let's go back here. The Iron Bank was charging the Lannister family 12% interest. And then we have these numbers here. But which one do we use? Which one do we use? Well, remember, GDP deflator, that's once again, go back to Unit 2 and review GDP deflators, especially if you're lost on that. But GDP deflator is another way of tracking the real inflation rates and tracking basically what the change in price index was. So GDP deflator is another way of tracking, basically saying inflation. So 12% minus 7% should give you 5%. Hopefully you guys figured that out. So anyways, yeah, and once again, you can read this all on your own when you're going through it if you're really lost on these, but I think this stuff's pretty straightforward. I don't want to bore you all out. All right, so that's it for topic 4.2. Next video, we'll move into topic 4.3.